It began with a sound no one should hear in the quiet of a November forest, the hollow clang of metal against a shovel. The man who swung it was clearing debris near the old campground road, a seasonal job before the snow arrived. His breath came out in slow, pale clouds. Under the blanket of fallen needles, the ground was dense and frozen near the roots of a birch tree. He thought at first he had struck a stone. Then the shovel caught on something smooth and round. He scraped away the dirt and saw a rim of faded blue. Rust flaked like old paint under his gloves. The shape was unmistakable, a barrel, industrial grade, the kind used for oil or chemicals. Only it didn't belong here, not miles from town. He tapped it once more and heard the dull, sealed echo inside, heavy but muted. Something shifted in that silence, something that felt alive and wrong. By the time the local police arrived, dusk had turned the forest into a tunnel of grey. They brought floodlights, and under the sterile beam, the barrel gleamed wetly with condensation. Two officers steadied it as they pried off the lid. A rush of trapped air escaped, stale and sweet with decay. The youngest officer stepped back, hand to his mouth. Inside were shapes wrapped in layers of plastic, compact and still. The lead detective called for the coroner, then stood for a long time watching the trees sway above. Her name was Miriam Cole, and she had worked enough cases to know what finality smelled like. Yet something in the scene unsettled her more than the sight itself. The placement felt deliberate. The barrel was too carefully hidden, too patiently forgotten. News spread by dawn. Reporters gathered at the barricade, their lenses fogged by breath. They asked if it was an accident, an old dump, a hunter's buried animal. No one answered. By mid-morning, a single headline cut through every radio: "Remains found in Pine Hollow Forest." The small town of Pine Hollow had known tragedy before: a drowned child, a missing hunter, but never this. People spoke quietly in diners, as if the woods themselves might overhear. The forest became a symbol overnight, a place both feared and mythologized. Parents warned their children not to wander near the old campground. The men who once hunted there avoided it altogether. Weeks later, the forensic team uncovered a second barrel only a few hundred yards away, identical in color and make. The pattern couldn't be chance. Investigators combed through manufacturing records, shipment logs, anything that could trace the containers. They found little. The company had gone out of business in the early 1980s. Most of its inventory sold for scrap. Cole spent hours in the evidence room staring at photographs, the barrels under frost, the wrapping, the fragments of cloth still clinging to bone. She thought about the symmetry of it, how someone had returned to the same place, years apart, to repeat the same ritual. There was patience in it, maybe even pride. Autumn bled into winter, and the case cooled almost as quickly as it began. Without identities, there could be no motive, no trail to follow. The victims became known only by what they were found inside, the Hollow Four. Their faces reconstructed in grayscale sketches hung on the wall beside other unsolved cases. 30 years later, in a building of steel and glass hundreds of miles away, another light flickered to life. A lab technician ran a sequence on a vial of bone powder. Its label faded almost to nothing. A digital progress bar crawled forward as data lines appeared, translating silence into code. Across time and technology, the forest whispered again. To understand how this began, we go back to 1978. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe now. It helps us bring more truth to light. In 1978, the town of Fairbridge was the kind of place where the day ended with the smell of pine resin and wood smoke. On the outskirts stood a small duplex with a sagging porch and a swing that squeaked in the wind. It belonged to a young woman named Laura Keane, 27, who shared it with her 3 daughters, Anna, Beth and Lily. Laura worked part-time at the diner near the highway exit, the one where truckers left quarters under their coffee cups, and the jukebox always seemed to play the same song about second chances. The job didn't pay much, but the regulars liked her. She had a quiet way of listening that made people linger. Some left notes on napkins, thank yous, small jokes, a sketch of a coffee cup with wings. She kept them folded in a tin box under the counter, telling the girls they were tiny postcards from strangers. Her days followed a rhythm of small hopes. Morning light through the kitchen window, packing school lunches wrapped in wax paper, tying ribbons in her daughter's hair, red for Anna, blue for Beth, yellow for Lily. After work, they'd walk down to the creek, tossing stones and collecting smooth pebbles for the jar on the windowsill. Each girl chose one stone, washed it, and named it. Laura said when the jar was full, they'd move somewhere warmer, closer to her sister out west. That dream was more than wishful talk. Letters between the sisters were constant, thin envelopes edged in blue and red. Eleanor wrote from Oregon, describing mountains as tall as God's shoulders, and a life free from the man Laura had left behind, a man whose temper had turned from storm to silence. She urged Laura to follow. The final letter before everything changed arrived in early autumn. Eleanor had found a rental near the coast, 2 bedrooms, walking distance to the school. "Come before the snow," she wrote. "You can start over here." Laura read it at the diner during a lull between lunch rushes. She refilled the coffee pots mechanically, her mind somewhere far beyond Fairbridge. That night, she took out an old suitcase and began sorting clothes on the bed. Dresses for church, sweaters for the girls, a box of photographs. One picture she couldn't pack away. Her and the girls at the county fair, sticky fingers from cotton candy, the red ribbon still in Anna's hair. She pinned it to the fridge. The next morning was cold enough to frost the porch rails. Laura bundled the girls for school, the air filled with the sound of boots on gravel. She waved to her neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker, who was hanging laundry on the line. Whitaker would later remember Laura's smile that morning as too hopeful to last. At the diner, a new customer sat at the counter, a man who introduced himself as Tom Reed, though no one remembered seeing him before. He ordered black coffee and a sandwich, watching Laura more than he ate. He asked where the road led past the campground, if the cabins were still for rent. She told him they'd been closed for years, but you could still fish the creek. He smiled in a way that made her uneasy. When he left, she found a $1 tip folded twice and a small grease smudge where his hand had rested. That evening, the girls waited for her outside the school, their breath white against the fading light. She picked them up in her old Ford sedan, the back seat piled with boxes and blankets. The plan was to spend the night at a friend's trailer near the state line, then continue west in the morning. But the car never made it past Pine Hollow. Witnesses later said they saw a blue pickup pulled over on the shoulder around dusk, hazard lights blinking. A man appeared to be helping a woman with a stalled car. Another recalled seeing children standing beside the road, one clutching a red ribbon. No one thought to stop. In Fairbridge, days turned to weeks. Mail piled up at Laura's porch. Her neighbor fed the cat through the window. The school called about the children's absence. Eleanor phoned the diner, only to hear that Laura hadn't shown for her shift. A missing persons report was filed, but without clear evidence of foul play, the search was brief. The woods were thick and the roads unmarked. By winter, snow had erased the tire tracks, and with them, the last trace of where she'd gone. Years later, when detectives pieced together her life, they found the small details still waiting, like clues preserved in amber. The tin box of napkin notes, the jar of creek stones, the photograph on the fridge, its edges curling but colors still bright. The landlord had boxed everything up when rent stopped coming, unaware he was preserving a history of warmth that would one day help strangers remember who she was. Laura's world had been ordinary, filled with the daily weight of survival and small, deliberate tenderness. Her laughter carried through thin walls, her daughter's songs echoed through the yard. When investigators looked through old utility records, they found the last power bill paid in exact change, each cent balanced, as if she had planned not to owe anyone anything. It's the ordinariness that makes it haunting. Nothing in Laura's life predicted the violence that would erase it. She had a plan, a destination, a letter promising safety. She had done everything right, left a bad man, cared for her children, saved for a better home. Yet between one heartbeat and the next, her name slipped into silence, carried only by the forest wind that never stopped whispering through Pine Hollow. The evening Laura and her daughters vanished was unremarkable in every visible way. The highway that cut through Pine Hollow was empty except for the occasional truck, its lights sliding across wet pavement like slow-moving stars. It had rained earlier, and the scent of pine needles hung thick in the air. At 6:40 p.m., a blue pickup was seen idling near the service road entrance. Witnesses later disagreed on the model. Some said Ford, others Chevrolet. But all remembered the same thing: the color, a faded sky blue that seemed almost luminous against the darkening forest. A sedan with a missing hubcap was parked just ahead, its hood propped open, steam curling from within. A man stood beside it, tall, in a brown jacket. He appeared to be speaking to a woman. 3 children waited nearby, one holding something red that fluttered in the wind. The rain began again around 7, the sky bruised purple, then black. By the time the sheriff's deputy drove by 30 minutes later, both vehicles were gone. Tire impressions were shallow, washed by runoff, but their tracks diverged, one toward town, one toward the woods. No one called it a crime that night. In small towns, disappearances start as delays, not disasters. When Laura missed her shift the next morning, the diner manager assumed she'd left early for Oregon. By the second week, the landlord noticed her mailbox full, her curtains drawn. Only after Eleanor called from the West Coast did police issue a missing person bulletin. The first search began 20 days later after hunters reported a foul odor near the abandoned campground. Officers followed the scent through thick brush until it disappeared into the wet soil. They found nothing but beer cans and animal bones. The file grew thinner with every passing week. The barrels waited for 9 more years. In 1987, the Pine Hollow redevelopment project brought county workers to clear a section of land once used as a storage area for logging equipment. The site was overgrown, a tangle of rusted metal and vine. A bulldozer stalled when its blade struck something solid. The operator stepped down, kicked at the dirt, and uncovered a rim of steel painted blue. He assumed it was chemical waste and called his supervisor. When investigators opened the first barrel, the contents were compacted, wrapped, and sealed. The plastic layers clung together, preserving what lay inside from time and air. Forensics at the time lacked the tools for deep DNA recovery. Identification would depend on clothing, bone measurements, and dental patterns. The coroner's report listed 1 adult female, 1 child, approximate age 7. Cause of death: indeterminate but consistent with blunt force trauma. Detective Miriam Cole, then only 32, logged every object found inside. A fragment of a plaid blanket, a single red hair ribbon, a child's shoe with a cracked buckle. Each item was photographed and bagged. The evidence room smelled faintly of disinfectant and pine cleaner, but the odor of the forest still lingered, metallic and sweet. Cole walked the perimeter of the dump site, noting tire marks embedded deep beneath the soil. The rain had hardened the clay, preserving faint impressions of tread patterns. She traced them toward the service road that ran parallel to Route 6, the same road where Laura's car had been last seen. The realization arrived like a quiet echo, familiar but unspeakable. Newspaper headlines carried the discovery for a week before fading. The remains were buried in unmarked graves at county expense. The local community attended a small memorial, leaving flowers without names. In her private notes, Cole wrote, 2 victims, possibly mother and child. No IDs, keep open. The case slept again until the year 2000, when a hiker's dog unearthed something metallic only a short distance from the original site. The barrel was smaller but identical in color and design. The call came in at dusk. Cole, now nearing retirement, returned to the same woods with a team of younger officers who had only heard the story as rumor. The second excavation was meticulous. Soil was scraped away layer by layer. A second red ribbon appeared, faded but intact. Inside were two more sets of remains, children of similar age to the first. All wrapped, all preserved. The forensic pathologist noted the uniformity, the same plastic material, same knot style, same method of sealing. The killer had returned years later to the same site to complete whatever he had begun. In the official timeline, both dumpings were connected through manufacturing data. The barrels were traced to a defunct chemical supplier, last active in 1975. Records of bulk purchase matched an account under the name Thomas Reddick, a mechanic once employed at Pine Hollow Trailer Camp, the same area Laura had been headed toward on her final night. Investigators searched the property where Reddick had lived. The trailer was long gone, but neighbors remembered him, quiet, skilled with tools, often fixing engines behind the old storage shed. He'd left town suddenly in 1980, leaving behind unpaid rent and a broken washing machine filled with grease rags. Among the remnants, officers found a ledger, the pages smudged with oil. On the last page was a list of names, none of them familiar. Beneath it, a note written in block letters: "Keep them close." The handwriting matched nothing on record, but the phrase would later haunt every report. The barrels were transported to the state forensic facility, where they were stored for re-examination once DNA technology advanced. Cole kept a sample from the first barrel in a sealed evidence bag, labeled Case 87PH1. For decades, it sat in cold storage. When she retired, she left a final message in the file margins: "Do not forget them." The unsolved timeline spanned nearly 40 years. Bridging two generations of investigators. Each time new technology emerged, the case reopened briefly, only to close again. Forensic sketches of the victims hung in the station hallway, faces of strangers given form by art and empathy. Over the years, their eyes seemed to change. What had once looked like pleading began to resemble patience. The oddest clue, however, came not from the barrels, but from the soil samples collected nearby. Analysts discovered trace fibers that didn't match any of the victims' clothing, fiberglass threads commonly used in industrial gloves. The gloves were rare, designed for high-temperature welding. Pine Hollow Trailer Camp's maintenance records listed only one employee with welding experience, Reddick, yet there was no documentation linking him directly to Laura Keene's disappearance. By 2003, the final excavation closed the active file once more. Without identification, motive remained speculative. The Hollow Four became a legend whispered in Pine Hollow schools, a story parents used to warn their children about strangers in trucks. But beneath folklore, the investigation file grew heavier with dust and unanswered questions. Forensic reports noted something else unusual about the barrels. Both sets had been sealed with identical adhesive compound, a brand discontinued in 1979. Chemical analysis later revealed traces of a rare solvent used for aircraft maintenance. It seemed irrelevant until decades later, when an inventory of Reddick's old workshop showed an empty drum labeled with the same chemical. Everything about the scene suggested precision, not panic. The killer had planned disposal with methodical care, perhaps rehearsed it. The location, remote but accessible, sheltered by pine cover, was chosen for longevity. Whoever placed those barrels understood time would be his accomplice. Cole often returned to the woods during her later years. She would stand among the birch trees, listening to the hum of wind through branches. She believed the site itself held memory, that places remembered even when people forgot. Sometimes she thought she could hear echoes of laughter, faint as the rustle of leaves, and she wondered if the forest mourned with her. In 2017, when the vial of bone powder was finally pulled from the freezer for modern sequencing, it carried more than genetic material. It carried the weight of 4 decades of waiting. But that moment, the turning of science toward memory, belonged to another chapter. What remained unresolved was a single line in the forensic inventory that no one could explain. Next to "Objects recovered, barrel 2", someone had typed an entry in faded ink. Item 247, red synthetic ribbon, not consistent with child's garment, origin unknown. It was identical to the others, yet slightly longer, as though it had once been tied around something larger than a child's hair. The investigation that followed the discovery in Pine Hollow stretched over decades, consuming officers, budgets, and belief itself. Every few years, a new detective took over the file, each convinced they would be the one to end the silence. Each, in turn, learned how silence has its own gravity. Detective Miriam Cole had led the first wave. In the late 80s, she chased dozens of dead ends. The barrels had yielded fingerprints. None matched any criminal database. Dental records produced nothing. The fillings were too common, the decay too extensive. The case demanded both urgency and patience, and both eroded under the weight of time. Local rumor turned against itself. People whispered about the trailer camp, the drifters, the families who left without notice. Cole interviewed welders, mechanics, hunters. One man, a former maintenance worker, admitted to knowing a man named Reddick, but described him as quiet, polite, always fixing something. When asked where he'd gone, the man shrugged. One day he just didn't come back. The case logs from 1989 read like a pattern of frustration. Followed up with Highway 6 lead, negative. Contacted Fairbridge PD, no matching MP reports. Interviewed relatives in Oregon, no confirmation. The last note of the year, written in Cole's looping cursive. Feels like chasing a ghost who planned the map himself. In the early 90s, the state assembled a task force for unsolved homicides. Pine Hollow was included. For a brief time, hope surged again. They reopened burial records, contacted the FBI, and even enlisted psychics, a move Cole resisted but couldn't stop. The psychic described a man with burned hands and children buried in pairs. None of it held up, yet it echoed eerily through later evidence. By 1994, the case consumed a single shelf in the evidence vault, one among hundreds. Cole visited less often, but when she did, she stayed long after others left, standing before the photographs as if waiting for the faces to blink. In 1997, a television crew from a regional crime show arrived. They set up outside the old campground, asking townspeople to recall anything unusual from the late 70s. A waitress remembered a woman with 3 girls who used to stop at the diner before heading west. Another thought she saw the same woman at a laundromat years later, but wasn't sure. The program aired once, then vanished in reruns. No calls came in. Eleanor Keene watched that broadcast from Oregon, recognizing the photo of the forest, but not yet knowing it was connected to her sister. She phoned the police hotline, but her call was routed through 3 departments and lost in paperwork. The report sat in a folder marked "Unverified Witness Claim." Then came 2000 and the second barrel. Cole, now 60, was called out of semi-retirement to consult. The press treated her as a relic, the detective who couldn't let go. She didn't argue. As she watched the second excavation, she realized that time itself had joined the investigation as a partner. The forest had protected the evidence, but also muted it. The forensic unit tried every new method: bone isotope testing, material analysis on the plastic. The results were too broad. North American origin, the lab concluded. That covered a continent. Over the next years, tips arrived sporadically, many cruel in their false hope. A man in Maine claimed his ex-wife had confessed to killing her children and hiding them in barrels. She was alive, her children grown. Another caller said the barrels were part of a toxic waste cover-up. Investigators drained funds, chasing conspiracy more than truth. In 2004, a rookie detective named Hartley reopened the file, certain he'd find what others missed. He traced the barrel's serial numbers again and contacted the defunct manufacturer's archives. The boxes arrived soaked from a leaky roof, paper fused together. Only a handful of invoices survived, including one billed to a Pine Hollow business address that no longer existed. It led back, again, to the name Reddick, but nothing else. One afternoon, Cole and Hartley met in the evidence room, the air cold with recycled air conditioning. She told him, "This case will teach you patience or break you, sometimes both." Hartley replied, "Maybe DNA will catch up before we die." Cole smiled, a thin line. "Then maybe it will take both of us." By 2007, the state trimmed budgets for cold cases. Pine Hollow was marked inactive. The word didn't mean closed, but it sounded like it. Files went into storage, stacked beside boxes from other decades. Cole officially retired. When she cleared her desk, she found a photograph of the first barrel taped under a drawer. She left it there, hidden again. Eleanor never stopped writing letters to the department. Every Christmas she mailed a new one, still hoping for an update. The replies grew shorter. No new information at this time. She kept them in a folder labeled Laura's Trail. In 2010, new detectives tried to match unidentified children's cases from across the region. They ran age progressions, cross-checked missing databases, none matched. The software produced faces that looked almost right, but not enough to name. The case remained in limbo, a puzzle missing not a piece, but the entire image. The emotional toll rippled outward. Officers who had once worked the case spoke of dreams filled with barrels, of faint knocking sounds in the woods. One retired coroner said he could never use pine-scented soap again. Fairbridge locals avoided the campground altogether. Someone hung wind chimes near the trailhead. No one admitted who. False suspects came and went. In 2012, a transient man was arrested after claiming he had put people in barrels. His fingerprints didn't match, but the story ran for weeks. When cleared, he disappeared back into the system. Another lead involved a scrapyard owner who had purchased similar barrels in the 70s. He died before questioning. Each failure drained belief. Cole, now widowed and living quietly near the coast, followed the case online. When journalists called, she declined interviews. Her last public statement came during a cold case conference in 2013. "The saddest part isn't what we don't know, it's that we stopped asking." That same year, the police archives relocated. During the transfer, a clerk noticed one of the Pine Hollow boxes marked with a faded tag, "Pending DNA." It was moved into the freezer vault, preserving the smallest fragments, bone dust, hair, fiber. No one realized that act of routine bureaucracy would keep the case alive. The human cost wasn't measured in money or time, but in erosion. Officers lost sleep, families lost faith, and the town lost its innocence twice, once when the barrels were found, and again when they became normal. By 2015, the file contained 37 formal leads, all closed. Suspect, Reddick, deceased, unverified. Vehicle, blue pickup, untraceable. Victims, unidentified female and minors, status pending. The final internal memo from the chief read, "Without viable DNA or familial comparison, probability of resolution negligible. Recommend closure." Hartley protested. He wrote back, "Closure isn't the same as justice." No one replied. In the end, it was silence again, the kind that filled every hallway when a case was marked inactive. The folders sealed, the evidence logged into permanent cold storage. Years later, when new technology breathed life back into the forgotten, those who had once worked the case were scattered across states, some gone entirely. But in 2015, all that existed was fatigue, the sense that time had won. In the final entry of the old logbook, written in black pen, someone, likely a clerk, added one quiet line beneath the closure recommendation: awaiting something new. In Oregon, the rain never stopped falling. It painted the streets silver and carried the smell of salt from the distant coast. Eleanor Keene learned to live with it, the same way she learned to live with waiting. She worked at a small library downtown, shelving books by habit, her fingers tracing the bindings as though they were veins of memory. Every evening after closing, she sat at her desk and wrote one letter, to police, to television stations, to anyone who might still remember. Her handwriting grew smaller over the years, the envelopes thinner. In the early days, she would receive replies typed on official letterhead: "Thank you for your inquiry. The investigation remains open." Later, there were postcards instead of letters, sometimes unsigned, sometimes printed with pre-written sympathy. She kept every one of them in a shoebox labeled Laura's Trail. The box smelled faintly of cedar and old ink, like something holy that refused to decay. Time reassembled her life in quiet ways. She remarried once, briefly, to a man who sold radios. He was kind, but could never understand the silences that haunted her. She left after 2 years, taking the cat and the box. She told him, "I can't share a life with someone who doesn't know what it means to still be looking." The world kept moving. Towns expanded, roads widened, forests thinned. What once felt eternal, the waiting, became something smaller, quieter. Yet every few years a stranger would call, a young journalist, a student, a retired officer. They would ask about her sister, about the photo of the 3 girls at the fair. Eleanor would tell them the same thing. "They're out there somewhere. I just want their names to come home." In 1998, a college student visited her, writing a paper on unsolved disappearances. He recorded their conversation on a cassette tape. She still had the player. She kept it in a drawer wrapped in cloth. When she pressed play decades later, the tape warbled, but her voice was still there, soft, certain, unbroken. "People say closure," she said on the recording. "But I think what we really want is confirmation that we weren't wrong to keep loving." Years melted into routine. The photo of Laura and the girls, once bright, faded into pale sepia. The red ribbon pinned to its corner remained vivid, as if color itself refused to forget. On Christmases, Eleanor hung 4 ornaments on the small pine tree she kept by her window, each shaped like a star. She would whisper their names, even though the world didn't yet know them. In 2005, she found a newspaper article online about the Hollow 4, a cold case from Vermont. There was a picture of a detective standing by trees, her hair gray, her face lined with purpose. Beneath the article, a detail caught Eleanor's eye. One of the victims, believed to be a woman in her 20s, with 3 children, vanished late 1970s. It was like reading her own life, printed by a stranger. She printed the article and circled the line in red ink. Then she wrote another letter, her 100th, maybe her 1000th, addressed simply to Cold Case Unit, Vermont State Police. It took 6 months for anyone to reply. The envelope was thin, but the words inside were enough to ignite something she had almost lost. The detective who wrote back was named Miriam Cole. "Your letter moved me," it began. "We cannot confirm connection without DNA. If you are willing to provide a sample, I will make sure it's preserved for future analysis." Eleanor read it 3 times, her hands trembling. She drove to the city clinic that same week, signed the forms, and mailed the kit. She didn't expect miracles, only continuity. "At least now," she told a friend, "a part of me will be there if the truth ever wakes up." The years after that became slower, almost kind. She stopped expecting the phone to ring, but still kept it plugged in. She walked along the coastal path at sunrise, carrying small stones she'd collected from the creek as a child. She'd throw one into the ocean each year, whispering, "For you." Meanwhile, far from Oregon, the Pine Hollow woods grew dense again. Saplings thickened where search teams had once walked. Hunters stopped mentioning the place entirely. For locals, the barrels became legend, a cautionary story to keep children from wandering. But for the few who remembered, the old sheriff, the retired coroner, the memory was heavier. The sheriff's wife said he still woke, sometimes muttering about the second barrel. In 2013, a true crime blogger rediscovered the case file online. He published a feature titled "The Forest That Kept Its Secret." It spread quietly through online forums. For the first time in years, people spoke the victim's nickname again. One reader, a young genealogist in Boston, recognized a detail in the report: the mention of hair ribbons preserved in evidence. She posted a comment beneath the article: "DNA could solve this if samples still exist." That comment found its way to Cole. She had retired, but habit kept her checking archived threads. She printed the post and pinned it to her corkboard under the heading "Hope Digital," her handwriting beside it, "Call the Lab." Back in Oregon, Eleanor received a small postcard the following spring. The front showed a photo of the Vermont State Forensic Lab. On the back, one handwritten line: "Your sample is safe." There was no signature, but she didn't need one. She framed the postcard beside the photo of Laura. The glass caught the morning light, and for a moment, the reflection of the two pictures overlapped, the past and the possible future. Each decade had taken something from her: youth, family, certainty, but it had left behind endurance. The letters had built a bridge across time, connecting strangers who would never meet but shared one purpose. When digital genealogy databases became common, Eleanor followed the news closely. She read about cases solved through relatives' DNA, about names restored after 50 years. She didn't pretend to understand the science, but she understood the feeling. "It's like memory but in numbers," she told her neighbor. "They can read what love left behind." By 2016, she was 83. Her hair had gone silver, her posture small, but her eyes were still sharp when she talked about Laura. She spoke less of grief and more of gratitude, that even after all this time, someone still cared enough to ask. Her final letter to the department was shorter than all the rest. It contained no plea, no pain, just a single sentence: "If the day ever comes, please tell them they were never forgotten." She sealed it, placed it on her desk, and left it unmailed. Some part of her knew the world was already moving toward that day, somewhere deep in a freezer, where a small vial waited for technology to catch up. Outside, the coastal sky turned pink and gold. She looked out across the ocean and thought of all the years that had passed, how time had not healed but had softened the edges, the way sea glass loses its sharpness. Somewhere far away, in a place of pine and cold earth, the story was still waiting. She whispered to the wind, "We're almost there. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop an emoji in the comments." In late autumn 2017, the freezer room in the Vermont State Forensic Laboratory hummed with a steady rhythm. He carried it to the supervising analyst, who scanned the file number. The record traced back 3 decades to Pine Hollow. "Cold case," she said softly. "They've been waiting a long time." The sample was transferred to the Genealogy division, a new program pairing public databases with forensic data. Under strict chain of custody, the bone powder was dissolved, purified, and placed into an amplification chamber. Machines began their quiet, relentless work, cycling through heat and cold, separating fragments, decoding silence. The screen filled with colored bars, millions of base pairs mapping out identity from dust. Over the following weeks, Ryan worked with analyst Leah Duvall to align the recovered genetic profile. When the computer finally produced a viable sequence, Leah uploaded it to the genealogy network. The process was routine, but what happened next was not. Within hours, partial family matches appeared. Fourth cousins, distant but undeniable. The data pointed toward the Pacific Northwest. Leah printed the relationship chart, each line a thread leading toward one name that appeared again and again: Keene. She turned to Ryan. "We've got a direction: Oregon." They cross-checked historical census records, birth certificates, and archived missing person bulletins. An old letter from 2005 in the Pine Hollow file caught Leah's eye, handwritten in neat script, signed Eleanor Keene. The letter had offered to submit a DNA sample, if it ever helps. Leah felt a pulse of recognition. She accessed the National Familial DNA Index. Eleanor's sample was there, still active, stored under voluntary consent. The lab initiated a comparison. Minutes stretched like hours until the monitor chimed. The screen displayed one sentence: "Maternal match confirmed." Leah exhaled. "We have her. We have them." The next morning, a conference room filled with quiet disbelief. Detective Hartley, now leading the cold case unit, reviewed the printouts. "So after 40 years, this is the family?" he asked. "Yes," Leah said. "The adult female and 2 of the children share mitochondrial DNA with Eleanor Keene. They're her sister and nieces." "What about the 4th child?" Leah hesitated. "Different lineage. Paternal. The markers match a known offender in the federal system. Deceased. Name: Thomas Reddick." For a long time, no one spoke. It was as if the past itself had exhaled. The connection was undeniable. 2 families bound by blood and violence. The final revelation came when analysts compared fingerprints recovered from the old ledger found near the trailer camp. The print matched Reddick's employment record from 1977. He had been the man by the roadside, the one in the blue truck. The discovery reframed the entire story. The barrels were no longer random artifacts of cruelty, but a chronicle of control. Reddick had killed the woman he once lived with and her children, his stepdaughters, and one of his own. The 4th child, his biological daughter, had been buried alongside them. Hartley drafted the press release with care. Words mattered now. After decades of uncertainty, the victims found in Pine Hollow Forest have been identified through advanced forensic genealogy. The offender, confirmed through DNA and historical evidence, is deceased. This case demonstrates the enduring power of science and persistence. When Eleanor received the call, it was morning on the Oregon coast. The light through her window was pale gold, the kind that blurs edges. The officer on the line spoke gently, explaining what they had found, who they had confirmed. She listened in silence, hand over her mouth. "Mom?" he asked finally. "Do you wish to know everything?" she answered. "I've known the end for years. I just needed the names to come home." In the weeks that followed, news outlets picked up the story. 40-year cold case solved through DNA. The headlines sounded clinical, but the impact was human. Donations arrived for a memorial fund. Strangers sent letters to the department thanking them for not forgetting. Cole, watching from her retirement home, saw the news report on television. She turned up the volume and smiled faintly when she heard the names read aloud. Laura Keene, Anna Keene, Beth Keene, Lily Reddick. The broadcast ended with footage of the memorial service. 4 headstones stood side by side under the Vermont sun, each adorned with fresh flowers and a ribbon tied to the base, red, blue, yellow, and white. Eleanor flew in for the ceremony. She walked slowly to the graves, holding a small tin box, the one filled with diner napkin notes that her sister once kept. She placed it beside the marker engraved with Laura's name. "You kept them safe," she whispered. "Now I can too." Reporters asked her how it felt to finally have answers. She said, "It's not justice I feel. It's gravity. The world finally stopped spinning without them." In the lab, Leah and Ryan logged the final confirmation reports into the national database. Case 87-PH1 was officially marked, identified, and closed. Before sealing the file, Leah added one small line at the bottom of the digital record, dedicated to those who waited. For weeks after, the Pine Hollow woods drew visitors who left ribbons tied to branches, symbols of remembrance. The forest that had hidden the truth became a place of quiet peace. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the light caught on one remaining barrel rim, now part of a small outdoor display near the memorial. Its blue surface had dulled with age, but under that fading paint, something glimmered, a reflection of sky, memory, and closure at last. Hit the like button if you believe justice always finds its way. Justice came quietly, not with sirens or handcuffs, but with a signature. When the Vermont Attorney General's office reviewed the Pine Hollow report in 2019, they ruled the case formally solved. The offender, Thomas Reddick, had died in prison 9 years earlier while serving a sentence for unrelated crimes. Yet the state decided the record would not close without acknowledgement. A ceremonial hearing was scheduled in the same courthouse where, 40 years before, the first search warrant for the barrels had been filed. On the morning of the hearing, the courtroom was full. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of reporters, former officers and townspeople who had grown old with the story. The presiding judge entered without flourish. He read the findings with the steady rhythm of history being rewritten. The forensic data, the witness accounts, the genealogical match. Each detail built a bridge backward through time. When he reached the final paragraph, he looked toward the room. The state of Vermont hereby recognizes the identification of the victims: Laura Keene, Anna Keene, Beth Keene, and Lily Reddick. The offender, Thomas Reddick, now deceased, is posthumously designated as responsible for their deaths. This case, by the power of science and perseverance, is closed in the name of truth. The silence that followed was deeper than applause. It was the silence of release. Detective Hartley sat beside Leah Duvall and Ryan Kim from the lab. Hartley's notebook was open, but his hand didn't move. He stared at the words, "Case closed," stamped in red on the folder before him. For years, he had imagined this moment ending with sirens, a trial, maybe even remorse. Instead, justice had arrived in data form, pure and unflinching. Outside the courthouse, a light snow began to fall. Eleanor stood on the steps, holding a small photograph of her sister, taken long before the world knew loss. The reporters approached gently, asking what closure meant after so long. She said, "It means we can stop searching the woods, but not stop remembering." In another state, a correctional archive clerk retrieved Reddick's old prison file. Inside were medical forms, disciplinary reports, and one handwritten statement filed during his last year of life. The note read, "No family to notify upon death." It carried no confession, no remorse, just the signature, crooked, fading. The irony was cruel. He had erased his own lineage as thoroughly as he'd tried to erase theirs. The Department of Justice authorized a public release of case materials for education and research. The barrels were documented, photographed, and transferred to the State Museum's forensic exhibit. Visitors could stand before the corroded metal and read the placard. Recovered 1987 and 2000. Identified through forensic genealogy. 2017-2019, symbol of persistence. Beneath it, 4 ribbons fluttered under glass. Cole's ashes were scattered the year before the final verdict, but her notes lived on in the file. One page had been photocopied and displayed at the exhibit's entrance. If the world forgets, then the evidence becomes the only memory left. People stopped to read it aloud, their reflections caught in the glass, layered over the words. The state also held a press briefing to mark the resolution. The governor spoke briefly, acknowledging the decades of work and the new era of technology. Behind him, a large screen displayed side-by-side images, the forensic reconstructions from the 1980s and the real family photographs found later. For a moment, the faces seemed to merge, science and memory reconciled. Reporters asked the Attorney General whether justice delayed was justice denied. He replied, Justice delayed is still justice recorded. The truth changes nothing for the dead, but everything for the living. Eleanor stayed in Vermont for several weeks after the hearing. She visited the memorial at Pine Hollow, walking the same trail that had once been closed by police tape. The air was sharp, pine-scented and full of echoes. At the site, she found a small plaque installed by the town. Here, names once lost were returned. She knelt to place 4 fresh flowers at its base. That night, she stayed in a small inn overlooking the forest. The room smelled faintly of cedar, like her home. She left the window open to the cold air and watched the snowfall blur the trees into silhouettes. Somewhere below, a single candle flickered at the memorial, left by someone she would never know. She thought about Miriam Cole, about Hartley and Leah, about every person who had touched the case and refused to let it die. In that web of persistence, she felt her sister's presence, not haunting but whole. The following spring, the museum held a remembrance event. Families of other cold cases attended, bringing photographs and ribbons of their own. Leah spoke about the science, the power of DNA to reconnect bloodlines after decades of silence. "Every cell is a story," she said, "and when we read it, we rewrite the ending." Hartley read a brief statement from the police department dedicating the case to those who never stopped asking. The crowd stood in a moment of quiet. When Eleanor was invited to speak, she simply held up the tin box of diner notes and said, she kept these because she believed every small kindness mattered. It did. It still does. Outside, the first spring light caught on the blue barrel's surface, transforming it from something that once concealed to something that revealed. Children visiting the exhibit pressed their hands to the glass, their reflections mingling with the forest behind them, unaware that they were part of the story now, the generation that would remember. In the years that followed, Pine Hollow became a place of pilgrimage. People came to leave ribbons, prayers, or simply stand in silence. The air was lighter there, as if the woods themselves had exhaled. Eleanor passed away quietly 2 years later. Among her belongings, the police found one final note on her bedside table. "You found them. That's enough." The case file rests now in the state archives, marked not by tragedy but by endurance. Its pages smell faintly of pine and ink and time, and somewhere beyond data and paper, 4 names continue to live in the steady heartbeat of those who refuse to forget. The forest no longer felt haunted. Visitors said there was a stillness in Pine Hollow now, a peace that seemed to hum beneath the wind. The ground that once hid its secrets had become a place of remembrance, not fear. Each year on the anniversary of the discovery, townspeople gathered to tie new ribbons to the branches, bright strands of red, blue, yellow, and white swaying in rhythm with the trees. They called it the Day of Names. At the State Museum, the exhibit remained open. Children pressed their faces to the glass, reading the story of the Hollow Four, their voices soft with wonder. Teachers spoke about science, about patience, about how even the smallest fragments of evidence could carry decades of hope. For the investigators who had once worked the case, the display was both grave and celebration, a testament to persistence. They had learned that justice isn't measured only by verdicts, but by remembrance. Ryan Kim, the lab technician who found the vial, still visited the site every autumn. He said it reminded him that discovery is rarely loud. It begins with curiosity and ends with care. Leah Duvall continued her work in forensic genealogy, solving other cases using the same process that had restored the Keene family's names. She kept a small red ribbon pinned above her desk. When asked why, she answered, "Because some stories don't end, they transform." The forest continued to change. Saplings grew where the path once ended, and the air smelled of pine and rain. In spring, the ground filled with wildflowers, tiny white blooms that spread across the clearing like unspoken prayers. For Eleanor's family, the aftermath was quieter. They scattered her ashes beside Laura's grave, fulfilling her final wish. On her headstone, beneath her name, were 4 small stars carved in a line. The inscription read, "Love is proof that time cannot bury truth." Across Vermont, the Pine Hollow case became part of training manuals, forensic textbooks, and documentaries about DNA genealogy. But for those who lived it, it was more than a case. It was a promise kept. If there was a lesson in the 40 years between loss and revelation, it was this: truth moves at its own pace. Sometimes it crawls through decades, gathering fragments, waiting for the right eyes to see. But it never disappears completely. It lingers in vials, in letters, in memories that refuse to fade. On quiet evenings, when the last visitors left the memorial and the woods fell silent again, the ribbons still rustled softly, whispering the names they once adorned. The wind carried those whispers into the canopy, through the light filtering down like forgiveness. Somewhere, perhaps, Laura's laughter was still folded into the sound of the trees. The story no longer belonged to sorrow alone. It had become something else, a reminder that even buried beneath years of silence, love endures and science listens. Which case should we tell next? Leave your suggestion below.